You've got my information there, and this is just, again, to give us a little bit of a frame into what we're going to be talking about. So I put together a slide on each of those 10 groups that were in that quick little poll. And I wanted to start with Francis Carre because first of all, some of you have heard of him and his firm, and he's probably behind David Adjaye, maybe the most well-known African architect. He was trained outside of Africa, as are most architects who are currently working on the African continent. The architectural training programs are still in the United States and Europe. And yet he has continued to work in Burkina Faso and East Africa all over the world. So what I wanted to show you here was in this quick image. This is a picture of a high school that he completed a few years back. And there's a couple things that he does that I think are really worth mentioning and worth imitating if we want to steal that and move it forward. One is the community involvement in his projects. So every project he does, especially on the African continent, but not exclusively, every project that he does, he's working with the community that it will be impacting, the community that will be using the space, and that's even if it's a private residential house. The other thing he's doing is working with local materials and local vernaculars. So local architectural history, local building strategies. And so what you're seeing here, and if I click on this, now I'm going to have to change my screen share so that you can see the Google Chrome window that I just opened. Hopefully now you are seeing a page from Carre Architecture. And this is the school in Burkina Faso. This is rural Sahel. You've got a beautiful shot of the overview of the school here. It's that round, almost donut-shaped building. This is during the rainy season. It rains for about 2 months out of the year in Burkina Faso, and so it's actually green, but the rest of the time it is dry. Think sandy beach. So the screen that you're seeing made out of what looks like bamboo up here, and this is just a local hardwood, that is to keep dust down during the dust season, which happens right before the rainy season starts and the winds start blowing down from the desert, and you get all of this dust in the air. And so by creating a central courtyard space like you see here, with this screening around it, and I apologize for scrolling a little bit quickly through his amazing drawings, but what I wanted to get was to this picture here of the students sitting outside their school. They are outside the school sitting on these wooden benches. You can see the louvers in action there, which can go up for ventilation, but also down for dust. There's no glass in those windows, it's just airflow. But that wooden screen then serves as a dust barrier, as a sun barrier, as a heat barrier, and it just looks like kind of a very rustic fencing structure that isn't on the surface, it isn't exciting all on its own, but when viewed within the context of where he's working, it really is a lovely way to integrate what's already familiar to people visually with sort of the technology of how do you improve the interior of a school space when you're dealing with tremendous heat, tremendous air, dust, potentially lack of electricity, so you need to depend on passive lighting and passive air circulation, and those are ways of doing it. ASA, or Active Social Architecture, is based in Rwanda. It was actually founded by a pair of Europeans who had studied in Italy, in Rome, and then moved to Rwanda and set up an architectural shop there. And so while they are expatriated from Italy, many of their partners that they work with are Rwandan or East African to a certain extent. And you see a similar visual trope here on this health center where they've used this kind of local, in this case it's closer to a bamboo, but this local wood to create this screened partition. Again, there's no glass in these windows, it's just that kind of wooden woven material to create, again, an enclosed courtyard, which opens then into kind of an open room, like a waiting room for this health center, and then the individual enclosed spaces for doctor's offices and whatnot are behind that space. And active social architecture, again, similar to Francis Carre, is very based in community input in all of their projects. So I've given you a couple of links up here just to their site, but the one I really want to click in on is their research page, because I think what ends up being really fantastic, oops, sorry, I did a very terrible screen share there, what's really lovely about ASA is that they do a fair amount of academic research and then they post that and make it publicly available. The one on this page that I'm most excited about is the biogas digester, which may not be of interest to many of you, but they post these beautiful PDFs of how they're dealing with bio-waste, human bio-waste, in spaces where you don't have public sewer systems or public waste treatment. And as a result, they're posting that up here. But the other thing that's happened a lot recently, as you know, is the COVID-19 experience has changed just about everything. The fact that we're having this conversation virtually being a case in point. And what I thought was really lovely about this is how generous they are in sharing their own thought processes, their own research, their own thinking about what might work in Rwanda, but also in the Czech Republic, as you see here, and in other cities where they've been looking at how do you make social spaces, gathering spaces that can withstand communicable disease. So in Liberia, in Rwanda, in Haiti, those communicable diseases traditionally have been tuberculosis. And now we're looking at Ebola and COVID and this range of more disease. And so this is going to be a direction that public spaces of any sort are going to have to deal with, and private spaces to a certain extent as well. So I think it's fascinating to look at how these firms from around the world are looking at the same sets of issues for different contexts and making those solutions relevant to their clientele. Going back now to my slideshow that just jumped out on me there for a minute, I apologize. What I wanted to also bring to your attention are some of the folks who are involved in various aspects of the design process, but aren't necessarily the architects. These might be the designers, the upholsterers, the interior decorators. And there's been a lot of innovation in these sort of smaller industries across the African continent, but globally as well. And given the new digital and technical economy and the order by mail economy, a lot of their work has been getting much more international notice. So you're looking at pavers. These essentially would replace brick or concrete indoor-outdoor paving that's made from recycled plastic. And this was Nzambe Mate's vision. She's the woman pictured down in the lower right with her staff, of taking plastic trash and converting it into these paver blocks that could be used as sort of outdoor terrace paving, parking lot paving, what have you. There is a lovely little YouTube video of her explaining this project and sort of her design of the machine that converts leftover plastic bags and leftover plastic bottles into these pavers. And they do ship them around the world. And they make to spec color and size and texture and density as far as indoor, outdoor, heavy duty, light duty. And while they're not sexy in any stretch of the imagination, they're extremely powerful in that what she's more interested in doing is removing plastic waste from the landscape. There's still an environmental impact to what she's doing because the machines that convert plastic bags into these blocks, you're heating and melting the plastic, that's producing toxic gas. So there is a trade-off that's not ideal, but the fact that she's able to generate, to convert something that's waste into something that's productive so it's not clogging up the landscape solves one problem. And the problem of the noxious fumes that are released in the process does await solving. And I think we're all kind of getting close to that because of thinking about the role that plastics play in our environment. My fifth grader just got home from his partial day of real human school, so I apologize for the background there. But I definitely recommend, if you want a feel-good video about the future of humanity because you've been depressed for far too long, that YouTube video is spectacular and will do you a world of good. Thinking also about potential partners in the architecture industry, I wanted to make you aware of Dion, who is a textile artist at the moment. She was a painter and an art gallerist and an extraordinarily important mover and shaker in the contemporary art world of Senegal. And she has now, over the past decade, set up essentially an upholstery shop in Dakar, just outside of the main city of Dakar, where she uses local techniques, local fabrics, and they're generating textiles for the upholstery industry, for interior design. She does speak English, A lot of her staff are fluent in French and Wolof and other languages that don't help Americans very much. But should you decide that this is a supplier that would be of interest to work with, she does speak English. Several of her team do as well. And so it is feasible to work with her even internationally about ordering textiles or even finished products, not just the raw fabric, but the actual finished upholstered item from her showroom. And this is just collection 2018. Her 2019 collection's also posted online along with some examples of her work at her website. And again, another YouTube video there for you, sort of with her explaining how she came to this process and the reason that she insists on kind of local manufacturing of these textiles, because Senegal has a very rich textile history that goes back to at least the Renaissance, and it may have in fact gone back a lot further than that. And so this technology, these techniques, these patterns date all the way back to that time. And Rufisque, which is where her workshop is located, is one of the kind of traditional nexuses of textile production. Textiles are woven by men in Senegal, so it's also a slightly different maybe craft profession, because I think a lot of us think of textiles as being made and woven by women in lots of cultures, but in Senegal in particular, this is a male-made product. So it's actually in this very funky way, it's employing a subset of craftsmen who have a very difficult time finding work in the international market because they are the quote-unquote wrong gender. So this is a kind of a lovely counterpoint to that, where you're actually looking at a male industry that's receiving support from a female proprietor who is keeping them employed throughout this kind of global economy in which we all live and work. One more, or a couple more actually, that I'll show you from the African continent before sliding to other parts of the world is Buildex. And some of you had mentioned hearing of Buildex. Buildex was formerly known as Orchid Studios. So if you've heard of Orchid Studios, you've actually heard of Buildex. This is sort of their third iteration of themselves over time. And Buildex does a lot of smaller work, lower scale, kind of cost-effective production. They are a design build studio. So they're the only firm that I'm actually showing you that is straight up design build. And what they've managed to do, again, is in their practice is to come up with almost like prototypes or building blocks that can be rearranged and reassembled. It's similar to what we might think of as prefabricated, but it's all made by hand. But I guess the patterns or the plans are all prefabricated. And so then they can take these pieces and adapt them to residences, schools, hotels, community centers. So they do some very elite work and a lot of community work as well. This was for a non-for-profit where they were tasked with building an on-site residential spaces for staff who worked at One Acre Fund. And One Acre Fund is an international NGO that works to get families an acre of land, teach them the skills to farm it or cultivate it productively and to generate income from that acre of land. So it's a relatively small scale NGO based in Kenya. And so they worked with Buildex, who is also based in Nairobi, to produce this particular complex for staff. So these are the staff that are then tasked with going out into the rural areas and working with landowners, new landowners, on how to manage their property and maintain it, hire staff, and sort of balance their budgets. So again, it's somewhat of it has a feel to it of being kind of a charity type organization. And yet if you go to Buildex's website, they are incredibly cosmopolitan and very up on technology and global structures and global possibilities. And so what they're doing is tapping into all of these global technological resources and then making them available on these hyper-local levels. So it's a really interesting model for international work. Erko Sanchez is relatively new to me. I was introduced to his work by a student of mine who actually is from Sierra Leone and had done some work as an intern with a principal who is now at Erko Sanchez. They're based out of Kenya as well. And this is a prototype for a building they're working on in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, for an apartment building. And Erko Sanchez is a European who moved to Nairobi and is based primarily in Nairobi. Does maintain an office in Berlin, as does Francis Carré. And so Berlin seems to be the other hotspot for a lot of folks who are doing work on the African continent. They'll tend to have an office in Berlin. It's actually more common than an office in Paris or New York. So Berlin is the other place to find these folks. But Erko Sanchez has been around for a long time, primarily involved in the industry of luxury building. So luxury hotels, luxury private villas, luxury apartment buildings, primarily in East and Central Africa. And so I bring his firm and his work into the mix because of the fact that this is not something that we necessarily associate with African countries, the sort of the luxury architecture market or the upscale boutique hotel or the kind of boutique high-end living arrangements. And he is really kind of putting to rest that myth that the African continent is full of impoverished people with no access to money or education or food. And in marketing his work and in providing this work to his clients, what we see is the capability of a lot of the African market to desire, pay for, sustain luxury high-end projects. And so I've given you two links for Erko Sanchez here, one just to his home base, but the other to his project page, because there are so many interesting projects that he's working on that are in progress or already finished. And this one's not finished yet. You're looking at renderings, lovely renderings, I must say, of this particular hotel that will go up in downtown Addis Ababa and hopefully open the next year or two, COVID notwithstanding. Sanchez also, I want to mention to you, all of you, that one of his partners is actually giving a lecture for Lehigh University on Monday from Kenya. So Monday at 12:30, and this may be where I messed up our time for today. Monday from 12:30 to 1:30, his partner, Jaime Perez, is going to be speaking to our architecture students and will be showing some of the work that he's done with various firms across East Africa, some of whom I've mentioned actually today. And if you'd like to join, you are more than welcome. There's a link later on in the presentation to give you access to register for that talk if you want to eat lunch and watch someone else speak with a lot more authority than I on some of these projects as far as the architectural details or questions you might have about how they're progressing or the work that they're doing. Okay. This is one of my favorites. Caulkin Studio is a firm it's based in Canada, the UK, and Indonesia. That's where their name comes from, Caulkin. So very international, global. This is a school project that they built in Vanuatu, which is a tiny little island in the Pacific. And this is an interior view of this school. What's amazing about Caulkin, and here's where I feel like they are a role model for the rest of us, is they have targeted all of their architectural production to the United Nations 17 goals for sustainable development. So if you look down at the bottom of this slide, they've got 6 sustainable development goals that they feel this project meets. And these are 6 of the 17 UN sustainable development goals that this project addresses directly. So I've given you the link to Caulkin here and how they define their own impact, but also the link to the Sustainable Development Framework as established by the UN. And what I think is really lovely, and I'm going to scoot over to the link at Caulkin. So pardon me for flipping my windows again on you. But this is Caulkin's website where they talk about, here are the 6 goals that the UN established that they focus on as their own targets for areas where they want to improve their own architectural practice, where they want to make sure that their structures are meeting these 6 challenges. And then there's 4 aspirational goals that they've included underneath those, where they say, these are within our wheelhouse to work towards achieving more of this. These are things that we can't do well yet and that we're striving towards. And so I think this is actually a really lovely model of how then do they measure those impacts? How do they balance their work against this UN framework? And if you look at those, you're not seeing all of the 17 goals here, but not all of these goals are sustainable the way we think of, like, okay, environmental sustainability or environmental friendliness or, climate change. That's in there, okay? But you'll notice that the first goal that the UN establishes as sustainable impact is no poverty, that poverty reduction should be the #1 goal. towards a sustainable future. And they're actually, I hate to say this, they are ordered in sort of the hierarchy that the UN feels is most important. So 17, partnerships. 13, climate action. Before that, though, we get education, gender equality, health and well-being, no poverty. And so they really are looking at this in a much more holistic fashion, even at the UN. And so this particular firm decided that they could match all of their work to those goals, both previous work and current work. That's what just flew by there was another view of that school building that I showed you. So their work is global in scope. Indonesia, Africa, Canada, working with indigenous populations, working with design build partners around the globe, working with local designers and interior decorators. So it's a really interesting model, and I recommend spending some time kind of digging through what they do, but more how they do it, because it's really exciting work. To quickly go back here, hopefully now you're all seeing the Caulkin building back up here on my slideshow. Here's our friend Shigeru Ravan. This is the sort of quintessential architect that got me interested in architecture outside of the United States. And these are just a couple of his projects that I found interesting because they weren't necessarily as predictable. The one on the lower right is one of his paper housing projects. This one was in Ecuador after an earthquake, but he's moved this model all over the world, sort of as disaster relief housing of the paper house or the local timber house. The transparent bathroom in Tokyo, I think, is really stunning as a piece of civic architecture, for the fact that you can see into it when it's empty and available, and the second you're in it, the glass goes opaque, and therefore you are shielded and can use the bathroom in privacy. But it handles so many issues: cleanliness, security, comfort, within this very elegant and expensive glass facade, that all of the things that make public bathrooms really difficult for people to stomach, either they smell, or they're dirty, or you don't know who's in there, or it's dark and you don't want to open the door in case someone's sleeping in there, all of that is dealt with in this design, which I think means that this one structure is performing so many tasks all at once, and therefore almost entirely self-containing. The house on the lower left, some of you may recognize, that was the first house that he built in 1995, for which he received kind of structural permission to use essentially soffit tubes as structural elements in architecture, and he's been doing it ever since. And so this is another piece of that sustainable, global, environmental, modern aesthetic that I think is really adaptable. We see this in the work of other firms in the African continent. We see Shigeru Ban doing it in Asia. And it's something to keep in mind that sometimes the more humble material is actually the more effective, more modern, more sexy material when thought of creatively. Sliding now over to Bangladesh and to kind of the southeast components of the Asian continent. These are two projects by Kashif Chowdhury, and Chowdhury's website is a disaster. It hasn't been updated, I think, since 2010, and it looks like it. I gave you the link up there anyway, but you will have much better luck finding his work in Arch Digest, in Design Boom, in the New York Times, and finding pictures of some of these things, primarily mosques, hospitals, civic architecture, some residential components of his work, and largely with these minimalist forms, inspired in large part by Louis Kahn, who did a fair amount of important work in Bangladesh, sort of in the middle of his career, but also with the idea of having buildings and spaces built at a human scale, despite the fact that they might be serving superhuman needs. So the mosque you're seeing on the bottom, the Changdong Mosque, and that's an exterior view of it, and then a view of the interior prayer hall, just this minimalist square with two inset circles. There's an oculus above the courtyard right here, and then the inner prayer hall has a second oculus above it where light comes in, and then at night it kind of glows. And he won an Aga Khan, it wasn't the actual award, it was an honorable mention, I think, for this particular mosque in Bangladesh. And it's actually not even quite as remarkable of a structure as the Friendship Center Hospital that you're seeing up above, which integrates this canal of water throughout the entire facility, serving both to kind of bring drainage to an area that's frequently inundated with water, but in this very kind of calm, controlled manner. So it brings kind of passive cooling to the spaces. It also does allow for tremendous rainflow to be washed quickly away from the facility as opposed to allowing the facility to flood. So a lot of that is very well thought and very well integrated with sort of the design, the landscape, the human use of the space. And those spaces of his are really worth thinking about, and how we can integrate kind of the environment into the need for the space within it. This is actually Marina Tapasu, who formerly married to Chowdhury, and they've worked together. They still actually do work together, although they each have their own independent architectural firms. Her website maybe is even worse than his. They really could use an American student intern, both of them, to redo their websites and bring them into the 21st century. What's much more interesting to me about Marina is the way she's able to speak about her work. She speaks like a professor of architecture. And for those of you who haven't seen her speak, I've put a link here for you for an Aga Khan talk that she gave at Harvard at the GSD not all that long ago. And hearing her speak about her work is so much better than seeing pictures of her work that are not well taken or well formatted. The picture on the left I stole from someone's Tumblr feed because it was one of the better pictures of this apartment building that I could find, that showed off sort of this modernist brickwork creating these variegated surfaces, while all of the windows were kind of kept to a single side of the facade to account for solar heating, solar gain inside the space in a very hot environment in Bangladesh. So this actually is two buildings. You can't see it. It's two identical buildings that face each other, and I just couldn't find a decent picture of them. So this fin work, when you stare at the two buildings from the side, it looks like two kind of partnered fins standing in the middle of this neighborhood in downtown Bangladesh. This is the architectural presentation on Monday. Jaime Perez, who will be speaking about some of the projects he's worked on in conjunction with Erko Sanchez, but also work that he did at Buildex when it was still Orchid Studios. There is a bit.ly link down at the bottom here that you can use to connect with this particular talk. And this talk with Perez will be run as a kind of a Zoom meeting, Zoom workshop. So as opposed to a webinar, which means you'll get to see everybody who's there and you'll get to ask questions and harass the speaker with anything you'd like to ask him. And so it will be a very kind of open, free-flowing format. The local AIA chapter here in Eastern Pennsylvania has invited its members as well. So it'll be a combination of students who are studying architecture and about to go to graduate school, Jaime sort of talking about his work, and then additional architectural professionals in the field. So you are all welcome to join in with this as well. It's absolutely free. And I don't think we have limits on registration, but we do ask that you go ahead and register in advance, mostly because we've got folks coming from all over the globe on this one, and it just helps us determine if we've attracted any Zoom bombers. I think they're lovely, but some people don't appreciate having Zoom bombers in their presentations. So I wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions, and I realize I may have blown that a little bit because of showing up so late to this conversation. But I really like this partnering of images that Erko Sanchez has on their website, where they were looking, this was an apartment complex that they did in Sierra Leone, and they went and they looked at all the falling down colonial architecture from when Sierra Leone was a British colony that was still left, that people were still kind of holding together with bits of string and glue to use as domestic spaces. And what they did was they took a very Afrofuturist view on that material and said, okay, we realized that indentured servants and slaves were forced to build this during the colonial period, and what would it look like if we were to reimagine that, without the colonial frame, keeping the same scale that people are used to, keeping the same style that people are now used to that feels like home. And what they came up with was the apartment block that you see down below, where they kind of converted them into these similarly scaled cubes and with similar colors, but very much removed the colonial presence of the British. So it was a really unique way of kind of taking a history and actually cleaning it up, kind of pulling it forward into something that still felt Sierra Leonean and unique, but also felt modern and clean and grown up, even as it sort of reflected back on a much more painful history. I would love to hear questions. If people have questions about particular projects, if people would like to have some time to sort of just go through this presentation on their own and watch the links, and then if there are questions and you want to email me later, I have included my email information on the presentation. So I would be thrilled to keep this conversation going in any way that's useful or helpful to all of you. Because as a teacher, that's what I'm here for, is to put you all in touch with the right people.
I think the first question is always the hardest, right? So I guess I'm happy to start and ask a question. I think we definitely have some time. So you've showed us some amazing work from Africa and then other nations that I think people think of as relatively undeveloped, whether they are or not. So I guess my question is, how do you begin to shift your mindset to really start to consider these places as really important opportunities to look at influence and new work and new technique, and think about how they may have an understanding of preventing disease in the built environment that we might not have because we haven't had to deal with some of the same things as them? Like, how do you create a perspective shift?
I think that's why I teach, because that's what I'm interested in being able to facilitate. And I find frequently when I'm teaching, one of the things I'm doing for about 80% of the time is undoing all the stereotypes. Everyone's seen National Geographic. Everyone has seen, pictures of starving African children with flies in their eyes and not wearing clothes, and they still keep playing that Christmas song about, do they know it's Christmas in Africa? So we're confronted with these really negative, persistent stereotypes of an entire continent that is impoverished and uncivilized. Just to help break that down, the continent of Africa and the African Union, which is sort of the political entity that coordinates activity on the African continent, contains 54 countries. Over 2,000 different ethnic groups are identified as inhabiting the African continent. It is 3 times the size of the United States. And there are over 3,500 unique languages spoken on this continent. So for reference, the country of Ghana, which is about as big as Connecticut, there are 60 documented languages that are spoken in Ghana, 60. When you're looking at that kind of linguistic diversity and attempting to take a state that was apportioned during the colonial period by the British, given British infrastructure, British language, British school systems, British legal systems, you realize the challenge in trying to undo that colonial legacy, because you have 60 different languages, which means you probably have 100 or so different ethnicities in a country the size of Connecticut, which means, first of all those people are polyglot. They can all speak 4 or 5 languages. And so as an American, when I tell students this, that, African children grow up speaking at least 3 or 4 languages, one of which isn't even born on their continent. They usually can speak English and or Spanish and French and German, along with 2 or 3 or 4 local African languages. So that information right there, I think, helps people realize that, you're dealing with something much more cosmopolitan than we tend to see in our own media in the United States. The second thing is that these populations tend to be very young. They are young. The average age right now in Senegal, which is a smaller country than Ghana in West Africa, is 15. And that tends to be more normal than not for most of the African continent. So you have a young upcoming population. They are hungry for education. They are hungry for political and social reform. And they are very well versed in global politics, global social, cultural, artistic movements. So these are folks who teach themselves English by watching TikTok. And they are very connected in ways that, my generation would never be to the rest of the world. And it shows. They are very savvy consumers of visual and social media. The last thing I'll say is that a lot of African countries, as they exist now, were formed as political entities, literally, in 1887 when Europe divided the continent amongst European powers, and then again between 1958 and 1974 when the European colonial parties left the continent. So Angola's only been its own country since 1974. I was born in 1974. That country and I are the same age. So when you think about these really young countries and what they're dealing with and the diversity within them, the kind of the exploitation that was wrought on their territories for over a century, 2 centuries in many cases, by Europe and other external powers, you realize you're essentially dealing with a continent in its teenage years. And there is so much potential there, and there is so much interest there in sustainable development, in human-focused development, in anti-racist development, that really is a place that we can learn. We can learn a lot of this. We can learn how to get comfortable with poverty, which is something Americans are not comfortable with, and we do not know how to talk about it or live with it or think about it other than sending folks to the food kitchen. Poverty is something that many West African individuals are very aware of, very understanding about how it works and sort of how to fix it and what it takes to change that. And so what you're seeing in a lot of the images that I showed you are architectural firms that are saying, okay, from a point of poverty, what are we actually able to do? And it's a lot. There's a lot that can be done for kind of very small financial investment with tremendous impact on the other side. So I think those are ways that we can start to shift our mentalities, is to remind ourselves that, how many languages do I speak? And how many different places have I visited, and how many different, cultures am I aware of, and how old is my country's political system? And then kind of keeping that in perspective, I think helps a lot when we're thinking about, well, what could I possibly learn from an African architect? Or what could a small school in Rwanda teach me about my school where I teach and work? And the answer is quite a bit in many cases.
So, as a person who personally, consumes a lot of media about art, about architecture, about interior design, there is woefully little, I think, about African architects and designers. And I'm just curious, do you have recommendations for where a person might look if they were interested and maybe didn't have like more academic access?
Sure. So the presentation that I'm going to give you the link for is one place to start.
Yeah.
And I think those firms then connect you to other firms. So again, Jaime Perez, who's talking on Monday, I've touched on some of the similar places where he has worked, but I've not talked about any of the projects that he's talking about. And a lot of these firms are not doing projects on their own, with the potential exception of Buildex, which does a lot of their own design build work on their own. But a lot of these firms are partnered internationally, or ASA is serving as the local for a different firm. And so their connections and their networks, which are evident on their own websites, are very useful places to start. And so that actually is one of the most helpful things I can suggest is, if there's a firm that I showed you today whose work looks really interesting, go dig them up, and they have all of their resources connected on their websites, with the exception of Chowdhury and Marina Tabasum's websites, which are pretty brutal. The rest of them are very sophisticated. And with Francis Carré and ASA posting their research pages and sort of the work that they're doing in research and publication and networking, there's a lot of information there on who else they're working with and who else are players in the field. I'm seeing a question from Andrew and asking me how I got started on this, and it was a complete accident, as most things are in life. I ended up in Senegal one summer and then never left, mentally, physically, and I kept sort of inventing ways to stay engaged with the Senegalese artistic community that I had met this was in 2004. I went for the first time to Senegal in 1998, and then in 2004 went back to the International Art Biennial and was able to meet contemporary African artists, primarily artists, working all over the continent in a single city, and that happens every 2 years in Dakar. So I've been going back every 2 years to those and then keeping in touch with those artists, but I've also just invented any number of excuses to keep that in my career path. So either teaching contemporary African art, teaching architecture, going and doing my own design build projects with students. I took a bunch of students to Senegal and showed them every type of residential house I could show them in a week. They were tired. And then they came home and I was like, all right, fix it, make it better, make it more. You've seen them, you've seen what people are living in, what would make it better? And so we were looking at things like solar loading and passive airflow and air conditioning and making tweaks to existing structures so that someone, for example, wouldn't have to rebuild their whole house to get a cooler indoor environment. They could add one or two tweaks and suddenly their house would be 15 degrees cooler. And this is what we were looking at as students. So it helps that I'm married to an architect and we contribute a lot to each other's work, whereas I call him up and I'm like, I need to know the word for this, this beautiful passive solar system that I'm seeing. I don't know what that's called. And he helps me, but then he's like, where did you find that? That's really cool, And so we've really informed each other quite a bit about what's out there from kind of the cultural, historical, social, but also technical perspective. So that's how I got here.
I think that's what struck us so much actually about our last conversation with Beresford Booth is just like this realization that there was so much stuff that we could potentially, draw inspiration from that was just out there that we had not captured. And it's a very intriguing idea that there's a whole continent of inspiration that hadn't tapped into. So I think that's kind of part of the amazing thing is that you came back with your students and said fix it, but in the same way they probably came back with things that they could use to fix their other projects.
Yeah, and I think that's actually been the most wonderful thing for me to watch is I end up with a lot of students from the business college in my class because the business students are told they have to take these classes in global and cultural diversity. And they all end up in front of me because they see the word Africa in the course title and they think, perfect, that'll work. But what I've discovered is that once they've had class with me, they think really differently about business and economics and finance. And so when the pandemic started, I had a student call me up and she's like, there's a micro lender in downtown Bethlehem where Lehigh is located, and they do a lot of personal loan work for people and individual that, traditional banks won't lend to because these folks don't have enough of a credit history. And I really think it would be important for Lehigh to get more involved working with them and the community development that they're doing. And how do I make that happen? And this is a tiny little blonde white girl who was in the business college to like major in finance and make a lot of money. And all of a sudden she was looking at all of these local businesses that were at risk of going under and saying, I could actually, I know how to fix this. Like I know how to do lending programs. How do I connect this all together? And that's the like paying it forward. That's the butterfly effect, right? Where jack squat about finance. But she was able to kind of put all this together and find ways to expand what she was capable of doing in a direction that was much more sustainable for kind of business and humanity in general. And so that was pretty cool to see that happen.
I think just one more question. Is there anything that you just generally wish that architects and designers knew, that you try to impart upon your students that maybe practicing people that haven't been able to take your class? Is there something that you wish that people knew?
Yeah, if it's ugly, people don't want to live in it. So that sounds really obnoxious, but one of the things that I'm up against all the time with my students is they're like, oh, well, if you're building for poor people, let's do that cool thing where you build a house out of plastic bottles or you build a house out of tires or you like dig a cave and that's the house, like that's sustainable housing. And I'm always saying to them, well, that's great. Do you want to live in a house made out of plastic bottles? Do you want to have to use an outhouse? What would make it, kind of breaking down that us versus them rhetoric of, well, we wouldn't do that, but that's good for them. They can have outdoor bathrooms. That's good enough for them, even though I would never use it. So I think that's the piece where I think empathy is really key. If I were in this position and in this community, how would I respond to a group of foreigners coming in and telling me they were going to build a bunch of public latrines or a school in my community and then leave? And then the community either has no idea how the building operates, doesn't know how to work the systems, can't afford to pay for the electricity to run the air conditioning system. So without that kind of connection to, is this actually relevant and useful to the community? There's no point in sort of making ourselves feel good by saying, okay, we're going to go and drop a school in Sierra Leone, put that on our website so our firm can pat itself on its back and feel good about that, when reality is that town maybe didn't need a school, but they needed a hospital, or they needed a community college where they could be teaching computer programming. And we went in there and built them something that A, they didn't want, and B, they can't maintain. And so it's just going to go to ruin. So I think that takes time. And that's the part I think that's hard for architects, is that you're not necessarily being paid for that kind of groundwork and that kind of research on the front end of a project. And that's where I think partnerships with some of these firms who are in those locations, and it's becoming much more acceptable to have an Africa-based location, can really solve a lot of that, or can help with a lot of that, where they can say, look, this is what we're working with, and we love that you want to get involved and bring your collaborators and your people with their incredible technology and your design fabricators and all of that. Here's what we actually need, and it's not an outdoor latrine. It's this. And so I think that ability to really know the communities where we're working, and that translates into our own communities as well. Not many of us like to live in the shadow of an ugly skyscraper. So how are we thinking about the quality of our own lives, and how do we ensure that we're making that quality available to people beyond just ourselves, and even in a residential market? So I think those are the things that I would, if I was going to be the queen, I would say I would love it if all architects were like, hey, what do these people really actually want, and not let me go build what I think they want, because that's where a lot of really bad buildings happen. I didn't show you those today. If you want to see pictures of really bad failures of people who sort of wanted to do the international feel-good building for a impoverished community somewhere, I can show you those. They're haunting. And I decided it would be better to show good stuff, good examples, model good behavior, rather than showing a bunch of crap that never should have been built in the first place. So.
I think we appreciate that. All right, last call for questions. I think we will send around the link to your presentation. And if there are any questions, if it's okay, I can share your email address.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. That's what it's in the presentation for. What I'll go ahead and do is, whoops, did I get that link right? I'm putting the link here. Somebody do me a favor and click on that link and make sure it's the right one. If it blocks you out, I will go back in and fix it.
I think it's perfect.
Does it work?
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Kart, for joining us. We are so grateful, and we appreciate the amazing presentation, and we are going to go through it and take what we've learned here out into the world.
Please do. And I'm horrified that I showed up on you so late and wasted a whole chunk of your time. So I'm really grateful that a few of you stuck around and waited for your professor to show up late to class. That's terrible on my part. But I hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Use anything you want from that presentation. Credit the architects. That's what I care about. And if anything comes of this and something turns out to be useful or productive for you, I'm thrilled. Then
we promise we will share it too. What we always say about these sessions is that once you join workshop, you really can't get away from us.
That's fine.
One of us now.
That's fine. Thank you all so much for being here. It was really an honor to be included